Hello and welcome to week 4 of Western Civilization 2 Online. Last week, of course, we spoke about the French Revolution, and we looked specifically, for the most part, in terms of what the French Revolution changed about French society in particular and European history in the broader view. Well, one of the things that the French Revolution had an effect on very largely was some of the individual actors that came out of the revolution. Undoubtedly, the most famous historical actor that came out of the French Revolution was a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte story is still told and still regaled upon. In some circles, he's understood as being a hero, a really one of the great men of history. In some circles, he's really understood as being a villain, a simple tyrant, somebody who was looking to take over Europe by military means, an egomaniac, a megalomaniac. So he has a very controversial stand in history in Europe still up until this day. Napoleon came upon the scene in the late 1790s in France, and he was, of course, a military officer. He was a child of the Revolution. He was actually from Corsica, of course. He was not from actually France, but Corsica was a French possession at that time. So he grew up understanding himself as being a Frenchman. He was from a minor noble family who had lost any semblance of power or economic standing in Corsican society. So he was really from not a very well-off family. But by his obvious gifts for military thinking, he really made his way in the world. He came about at the right time in history because at any previous time, Napoleon would have undoubtedly been perhaps a minor military officer. But in the French Revolutionary Army, minor military officers that showed great skill, no matter where they were from or what background they had the ability to move up the ranks. And this is what Napoleon did. It was obvious that he was a military genius from the get-go. He was a very young, early 20-something general in the French Revolutionary Army. And he made a name for himself by turning cannon onto a counter-revolutionary crowd in the late 1790s. He was obviously a very political man. He wanted to have power, and he wanted to have power in France. Well, what happened was that Napoleon became, by moving up the ranks of the military world and by winning important victories for the French Revolutionary Army, he became a public hero. He soon became part of, after the revolution had moved away from its reactionary days after the very radical days of the 1792, 93, and 94 terror into the so-called Thermidorian reaction. By the late 1790s, the French revolutionaries were in what was known as the Consulate. And the Consulate was a pullback from the Roman Republican days. Counselors were the people who were the heads of the Senate in the old Roman Republic. Well, Napoleon was one of these counselors, one of three. Well, what happened was, of course, in 1799, Napoleon saw a chance to basically grab power for himself. And he did this by using the military in a coup d'etat in 1799. This was an important day, obviously, in French military and political history. Napoleon obviously was made by the French Revolution. He was a man of the Revolution. However, he was also understanding of the fear that revolutionary change could bring to the people. So what he did when he came into power in 1799 by himself was he tried to slow down any of the more radical aspects of the revolution that still existed. One of the things he did was he published this Napoleonic Code, as it was known. And basically this was a law code. And this law code, in many ways, revised the older, more radical laws that came out of the French Revolution and made the laws much more traditional for French society. In other words, what he was doing was for instance, giving fathers more and more traditional rights over their children and over their wives. What he was doing was he was trying to both keep revolutionary thought intact, but also look to those more conservative people and keep them on board and keep himself in a popular position. He was extremely popular. Undoubtedly, part of his popularity had to do with the fact that he kept the French revolutionary armies in the field and kept winning sometimes improbable victories. He, in 1804, feeling that he was in danger of being overthrown, he always utilized these fears of being overthrown. He called himself the new French emperor. He called the Pope to Paris to have a very old medieval symbolic ritual in which he would be crowned as the new French emperor, kind of throwing back to the days of even Charlemagne of the 9th century in France. Well, what he did, and this is just kind of a symbol of the myth of Napoleon, he of course took the crown from the Pope and placed it onto his own head. So in other words, he needed the Pope there for the symbolism, for the meaning of the Pope and the Catholic Church being a part of this. But he was the actor. He was the historical actor that put this crown onto his head. Obviously, if the Pope was there, we have a time period, and Napoleon understood this as well, of trying to clear the air between the French nation and the Catholic Church. Napoleon understood that Catholicism was very strong in many French men and French women's hearts and in French culture. He was not necessarily religious himself, but what he did was he wanted to make amends with the French Catholic Church and the Catholic Church in general, to bring the Catholic Church into his government and make his government seem perhaps ordained upon by the Church and by God. So he made amends with the Catholic Church, trying to cover up all of the hatred that exists between the Catholic Church and the earlier revolutionaries. Though he was conservative in a sense, he was also very revolutionary in other ways. He was conservative in the sense that he slowed things down in France itself, but he was more revolutionary in terms of bringing revolutionary thought and the aspects of the French Revolution to many other parts of Europe. And hence he was understood as being a hero by many radicals in other parts of Europe, and he was understood as being the devil to conservatives in other parts of Europe. This is portrayed very well by Leo Tolstoy in his masterwork, War and Peace, which was actually written in the 1860s, but it's about the Napoleonic Wars that were occurring at this time. And the first scene is with a couple of Italian nobles speaking and mentioning, or I'm sorry, a couple of Russian nobles speaking and mentioning the idea that Napoleon is actually the devil. Not just that he is a bad man, but that he is actually the devil incarnate. And this is how many conservatives throughout Europe viewed him, because he was militarily pushing the revolution onto others. And he was very successful at this. Of course, Napoleon is most famous for his military victories and for spreading French society, politics, and culture throughout much of Europe. He defeated the Prussians. He defeated the Austrians numerous times. He even defeated the Russians numerous times. And while doing this, he gained more and more land. What he did was, again, in this, he's kind of a paradox, because what he did was he became emperor of these areas, and he looked to his own family members and placed them on the thrones of many of these old nations. Places like Spain, he put one of his brothers onto the throne of Spain after he defeated the Spanish king. In places such as Prussia, in places such as Italy, even in closer parts to Russia and to Poland. The place that he could not defeat, of course, was England, and he had numerous plans to eventually invade England and make England basically just another state in the Napoleonic orbit. But he was never able to do this. As with many military men and dictators throughout European history, Napoleon pushed too far. And what he did was, one, he pushed upon other cultures, the French culture and French society, and revolutionary thoughts. And what this did was, even for those who may have been more radical, more outspoken in other areas of Europe, they started to view the French as outsiders, as forces being put upon them. And what Napoleon, not by his own intent, did was he gave rise to a lot of nationalistic feeling in places such as German states like Prussia, where they viewed the French as outsiders and and felt that they wanted to keep some of these French ideas necessarily, kick the French out, and make Prussia or Germany one state. This was a very important aspect of the effect that Napoleonic ideology had on Europe. Of course, Napoleon pushed too far in his military adventures also by attempting to defeat and if possible, control Russia. Of course, the famous story is that Napoleon moved quickly through Russia, but the Russians were brilliant in their military tactics by basically having a slash and burn policy. So as the Napoleonic armies advanced, a huge army, bigger than any that had ever been seen in European history up to that time, as the Napoleonic army advanced, the Russians slashed and burned both cities, crops, everything that was necessary for the French army to survive. Well, as the French got farther and farther into the Russian heartland and winter came on, of course, the French eventually had to just withdraw because it was obvious that the Russians were not going to stand up and fight the French army. As they withdrew, they were sacked by guerrillas, by illness, by cold, and it was a horrible loss for Napoleon that he could never recover from. From that point on, the Russian victory against the French gave rise to, of course, the Austrians coming back in, the Prussians and the British all fighting together against Napoleon. They would finally defeat Napoleon in 1813 and 1814 and send him into exile. However, where he was sent to exile, he escaped, came back to France, and rose and got another army together. He was understood as being a hero again in France. Got another army together, marched into the Netherlands, and was defeated by a coalition force of British, Prussian, Russian, and Austrian troops at the Battle of Waterloo. He was captured and, of course, sent into exile in a place he could never come back from, and that was the island of St. Helena, where he ended up dying many years later. There were always concerns that he would try to escape again. He was always looking to try to escape, to basically come back and to take his place at the rightful throne of France, and basically control Europe completely. This is what his hope always was, but it never, of course, occurred. Well, what Napoleon did was he scared the old European powers something awful. And the old European powers in 1815 got together at this place at Vienna in Austria, and they basically realized that what they wanted to do was to turn the clock back, to put the revolution and all of its ideas and problems back in a box. And this is what they tried to do. It was a reactionary time. They tried to go back to a time before the revolution. And as we'll see in our next couple of lectures, this is something they could not do, because even though Napoleon was defeated, even though France was absolutely drained of manpower and was under the thumb now of these old European powers of Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia, it did not matter. You could not put these ideas back in the box, and these ideas would be extremely powerful and would lead to numerous changes in European society and politics throughout the 19th and the 20th century. So that's what we'll start talking about in our next lecture.